Hi, returning after a video issue there. So I'm going to just be picking up the second half of lecture 3. And I was just explaining about the significance of German idealism. I gave a pretty accurate and precise, but therefore formidably complex description, followed by a much more relatable, accessible description, just using a big word, reason, to summarize the Enlightenment. And so I now want to situate the first more philosophically precise but difficult explanation in terms of the second more accessible one. And then by virtue of doing this, I will be able to briefly situate the significance of Kierkegaard. So the Enlightenment, and there's a lot of great accounts of it. I still think if you're interested, Ernst Cassir's book is a great place to start, but there's major evolution in the historiography of the Enlightenment all the way up to Jonathan Israel. But Cassir, if you're interested in the history of philosophy, is excellent. And Cassir gives many examples in his book on the Enlightenment of how self-conscious the philosophers and other Enlightenment thinkers were about representing reason. So what's very important to understand is that a self-conscious Enlightenment philosopher, and someone like Steven Pinker, puts himself in this tradition, arguably, even if he doesn't understand that tradition, perfectly, he is a modern example of this. A person who claims to be a representative of the Enlightenment generally takes it upon themselves to be an avatar of reason. That is, they give themselves the great credit, whether earned or not, I'm not contesting, this is simply a fact. They give themselves a great credit of doing work which is an embodiment of rationality itself, or is in humble and excellent service to reason. And so reason is sort of the chief god, self-conscious god of the Enlightenment philosopher. You could say that's great. Reason, in a sense, has always been a kind of god. Nous is a divine thing. But the question is, what does that actually mean? Well, it means functionally there's what you could call the Enlightenment ideology, which is that to the extent a thinker is invested in characterizing themselves as part of an Enlightenment tradition, they will be invested in characterizing their own philosophy as having a special attribute of rationality and reason. And therefore, they will characterize their opponents, typically in a polemical fashion, as being enemies of reason. And so you get this kind of like narrative in the so-called counter-enlightenment, and there is some real figures who are anti-enlightenment, but that doesn't mean that they don't believe in reason, right? Hamann is, on my view, more subtle thinker on reason than any enlightenment thinker ever was. But Hamann is characterized by someone like Isaiah Berlin, who I like Berlin in many ways. I just think his stuff on Hamann isn't his best work. He's characterized in a way as if he's part of some essentially right-wing fascist, movement that leads all the way from people like de Maistre to people like Hitler, and this is quite frankly nonsense. So I don't trust these narratives of the counter-enlightenment. They generally come from people who might have excellent historical reasons, like Berlin himself, for being extremely concerned about the excesses of both reason and reaction. But the simple fact is, it's less useful to categorize people into big concepts that we don't understand, and more useful to do honest and detailed work on them that we then attempt to summarize in a responsible way and then generalize from those summaries. So now you can say, what does this have to do with the Enlightenment? Well, you have to remember the German idealists, broadly speaking, all see themselves, certainly in their early systematic work. Something like the late Schelling gets a lot more complicated. But certainly in the early systematic work of Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, Reinhold, they see themselves as, in a deep sense, heirs of Immanuel Kant, even if they see themselves as completing him, like Fichte or Hegel, or surpassing him as they thought. But they see themselves as heirs of what he was doing, and therefore related to that as heirs of the Enlightenment. But these are thinkers of a kind of, quite frankly, incomparable philosophical power compared to the Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century. And so when they think of themselves as embodiments of reason, they take this very seriously. For example, if you read Fichte, Fichte is existentially related to reason. Reason really is like a divinity to Fichte. And Vernunft is like this in the German idealist tradition for very good reason, because Vernunft is essentially in relationship to Verstand, you could say reason and understanding. It's not unlike the distinction between nous and logos, although there's actually a million words for logos that are used in Greek philosophy that what we translate as reason, and the Stoics and stuff But it's like that distinction that becomes in Latin to distinguish between intellectus, to translate the Greek nous, and then ratio, to translate, roughly speaking, the concept that we call logos. And so in the German idealist tradition, there is a deep inheritance of the ancient and medieval traditions, sometimes less self-conscious, sometimes not. Schelling, for example, is a bit more self-conscious and interested, I would say, in ancient Greek philosophy than some of the others. But there is a very self-conscious also attempt to create in their own philosophies a systematic and justifiable account of what reason is. And in the attempt to give an account of what reason is, they believe that the only thing that can be giving such an account is reason itself. And if you read Kant very carefully in the prefaces to his works, in the conclusions, for example, the first critique, if you read the prefaces, the introductions, the conclusions, any of Kant's framing material, you will see that Kant believes his work to embody reason itself as a faculty and to have made a definitive contribution to the closing off of the boundaries of reason. Now that idea, which Eckhart Forster wrote a wonderful book about called 25 Years of Philosophy, that idea that sort of philosophy was ending is very important because the German idealist tradition has, you could say, a messianic and a very positive apocalyptic self-understanding sort of built into it from go because of Kant. And this ultimately gets into very complicated stuff to do with Kant and his relationship to Christianity, and I'm not going to go into that here. But the important thing is to now come back, you can see the self-interpretation of reason is what the German idealist systems see themselves as doing in doing philosophy. That is, philosophy is coming to articulacy as reason itself is coming to a stage of articulacy. This is particularly, you could say there's a Hegelian slant to this, but there's just the general idea that in the emergence of Selbstbewusstsein, or self-consciousness, what is emerging is in fact the most powerful distinctive faculty of the human being itself, reason or Vernunft, and that faculty is then the source and the object of the act of self-interpretation. So for a philosopher to understand a philosopher's self as a philosopher, this is very German idealistic talk, is in a sense for reason to understand itself in an embodied form. And then there is a kind of mystical dimension to which it seems possible in some of the idealists that through an understanding of yourself in your finite and embodied condition, you can also transcend that to an understanding of reason, you could say, in its infinite capacity or its infinite and unlimited power. And that, quite frankly, has direct and deep debts to Platonism. But that, again, gets into pretty heavy sledding if a person hasn't done the ancient material first. So that is very important. Now, how does it relate to Kierkegaard? Very simply, in the emphasis on reason, there is a corresponding emphasis on activity, Tätigkeit. And this is a very ancient bias because in the ancient world, there was a distinction, of course, between passive and active or receptive and active dimensions of any movement or action, particularly, for example, in Aristotle's categories. And reason was generally thought of in the state of actuality as being an activity, of course. So if you know your Plato and you know your Aristotle well, you'll know that the state of actualization or activity, another good rendering of energeia in Aristotle, is a state of ongoing sort of motionless motion. It's very complicated to relate the idea of activity to the idea of action and the idea of motion. But for Aristotle, nous, reason in its divine singular form that gives birth in a way to the intelligibility of the world, if not the world itself, nous is fundamentally active, even though it also has a passive dimension. And as you know, if you know anything about Latin aphorism and medieval Islamic and philosophy and theology generally, passive intellect is very important, but however, it is itself its own story, and you need to know the active part too. So reason has been identified with activity since its inception, in a sense, in a form of consciousness in the Platonic tradition. So the idealists are quite congruous with this tradition, but the result is there's an extraordinarily strong self-assertiveness in German idealist philosophy. There's an extraordinarily strong resistance, you could say, to the finite and the embodied and the corporeal. Now, there's many scholars who want to push back against this interpretation, but the simple fact is this interpretation has been a consistent leitmotif in the history of German idealism for a good reason, because it's justified at least by some of the sources, especially Fichte and especially aspects of, Hegel and Schelling's philosophy, at least in early periods. So Kierkegaard is, in this context, part of a very conscious reaction that you could say is spearheaded by the German Romantics against this emphasis on activity and towards an emphasis on receptivity, harmony, and balance. So Kierkegaard inherits both the incredible emphasis on the philosophy of self-consciousness and the idea of reason as, in a sense, self-grasping understanding, yet he also inherits a very deep commitment to the finitude of the human condition, arguably, in his case, certainly the fallenness of the human condition as a Christian and a deep Lutheran. And therefore, his philosophy is essentially, as I interpret it, is a synthesis of German idealism with German romanticism that creates the foundations of what we call existentialism. And I do believe Kierkegaard has a very good claim to being the first existentialist insofar as such claims ever make any sense. That's another story. Maybe I'll do something on Kierkegaard in a different context. But this is very important because when I turn to Kierkegaard in a later lecture to give you an exposition of some of his ideas necessary to understand Heidegger, I will want to assume this material. So the big story, very simply, is the self-interpretation of reason as a continuation of the Enlightenment narrative, also in conjunction with the philosophy as a university discipline, and therefore there's a stress on philosophy as a kind of science. And so Kierkegaard's reaction against German idealism, which assimilates almost all of its insights, but is drastically critical of what Kierkegaard sees as its errors and excesses, like the Romantics. One of these errors and excesses Kierkegaard thinks is the idea that philosophy can be a science. Kierkegaard does not think philosophy can be a science, and I think the historical evidence suggests Kierkegaard is more right than Hegel and the idealists were. But it's very important you understand the Neo-Kantian philosophers in the tradition Heidegger was trained in, they thought of philosophy as a science. So Husserl famously talked about needing a philosophy that was eine strenge Wissenschaft, a rigorous science, a rigorous academic discipline that met all of the criterion of rationality that any science, natural, social, or historical, should or would or could meet. So this idea of science as a form of rationality itself and philosophy as the highest stage of reason itself is, you could say, the way in which the German idealist tradition, in union with the institution of the modern university, culminates in a certain sense and therefore transforms the Enlightenment narrative of the progress of reason towards a kind of self-perfection in history. So therefore, this means there's always a kind of complex, not even meta-narrative, but just a deeper level of narrative that when thinkers are in the German idealist tradition, whether they're consciously for it or against it, they're going to also be consciously or unconsciously reacting against these very big narrative arcs about progress of science, the nature of science, whether philosophy is a science, whether philosophy is the embodiment of reason, what reason really is, what its powers are, whether it's infinite, right? This is all just baked into what the 20th century is inheriting. And so after the brief spell of attempting to ignore the German idealists, kind of in the middle, where there's a very positivist moment, there's a huge materialism controversy in the 19th century in Germany, you get the Neo-Kantian movement it says zurück zu Kant, back to Kant, and therefore back to kind of deep worries and wonders about what is reason itself. Is philosophy a science? If it's not, why is it in the university, right? So my own work is in a way very consciously part of this tradition. It's why I'm very concerned as an academic philosopher about whether academic philosophy should even exist, because it's not obvious that it should in a certain sense. And it wasn't obvious to its great founders in the modern research tradition. They thought it only should because they thought their systems were scientific culminations of reason, which whatever else they were, they probably weren't that. So Heidegger inherits Kierkegaard in a very specific way that you have to understand Kierkegaard to appreciate. But I hope you can see just from this what it means that Heidegger's inheriting Kierkegaard and German idealism. He's inheriting both the greatest evolution of reason's sort of self-articulacy in history, reason's confidence and reason's power. He's also inheriting the most powerful, devastating critiques of reason and of science from the 19th century, not just in Kierkegaard, but of course also in people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But I do think Kierkegaard is actually an enormously significant figure, much more important in a way than Nietzsche is, even though Heidegger writes very long long-winded works on Nietzsche. I think Nietzsche was easier for him to write about because he was less directly influential on his thought. So that is the German idealist part. Now, very briefly, in 5 minutes, I'll just mention what the scholastic part is in connection to ancient philosophy, and I'll pick up those threads as we do more context in subsequent lectures. So the scholastic part is simply you have to have a basic understanding of what was important in the theology and philosophy of the Middle Ages. And what I will focus on, because that's a massive topic, is the existence-essence distinction and its significance for the thought of Thomas Aquinas. So that I won't do a whole bunch about that. It's written up in my book, but I'll give you a very basic overview in one of the subsequent lectures. And frankly, to understand that, that'll lead us naturally back to the ancient world, to the tradition of metaphysics. So that's I said I wanted to say more in the second part of the lecture about what is the actual context that we need in order to approach this text. And I want to address something. You could say, well, Sam, that seems like a lot. It's like, again, may I please have us all remember that Heidegger saw himself as the end of a tradition that is over 2,000 years long. So if one thinks it is unreasonable to be expected to have some minimal knowledge of that tradition, one is also implicitly thinking it is unreasonable to expect to understand Heidegger. So often Heidegger is not understood for the very simple reason, not that he's great, not that he's profound, which he may be, but that he is at the end of a tradition that no one today in general is taught in school to study. So unless you're in a French or Italian or generally European German tradition where the history of philosophy is still the extremely living part of the university curriculum, unless you're in those traditions in which I know I'm talking, you know your history of philosophy much better than the typical Anglophone philosophers do today, it's simply not the case in the Anglophone world in leading universities that people have a remotely elementary understanding of the arc of the history of philosophy. And you can get that. Just read Copleston's 9-volume history of philosophy is for a starter, for example, which I have all of my students slowly read through before they go through a kind of basic first certification process in knowing philosophy. And they read the primary sources too. But I mean, there's great works here. If you just systematically read for a few years, you can know a lot about what you need to know to interpret hard texts. But you do have to do this work, to be perfectly honest. And people, on Twitter once, someone was like, what do I need to do to understand Aquinas? And I was like, well, you need to understand Aristotle. And they're like, well, that's a bit more than I was hoping for. It's kind of like, well, sorry. Aquinas thought Aristotle was the greatest philosopher ever, and his work is in a large part a commentary on Aristotle. So if you don't understand Aristotle, you cannot understand Thomas Aquinas, certainly not as an original thinker, because you won't know the difference between what's Thomas and what is Aristotle. Okay? Now, talking about Thomas and Aristotle brings me to the last third of the lecture, which is the actual subject matter treatment of the context of Heidegger's book as a work of metaphysics. So now I just want to end with some, let's say, gentle ruminations on a few confusions about metaphysics in contemporary philosophy and theology. First of all, metaphysics, as I mentioned, and I need to stress this, metaphysics is not something that either Plato or Aristotle ever talked about or said they were doing. Okay? The book that we call the Metaphysics, that we get some of the most seminal passages about metaphysics in ancient philosophy from, that is Aristotle's Metaphysics, as everyone knows, we think was titled that simply because of where it was located in the canon that we've inherited of his writings from Theophrastus. Now, Aristotle himself uses two different terms. Whether they're synonymous is itself part of a controversy, and I'm not getting into that level of this. Certainly not in a Heidegger lecture series on YouTube. However, I just want you to know it is controversial, but I'm not going to treat it as controversial right now. There are two different terms Aristotle uses in the Metaphysics. Okay, one is first philosophy, and the other is theology. Why theology? Because the proper objects of the special science that Aristotle is often describing in the Metaphysics are divine, and this is incontrovertible. Every competent student or scholar of Aristotle knows this, and any competent student of the ancient world knows why. The highest entities in the cosmos for all of antiquity, as for all of non-Western, non-modern history, that is to say, in contemporary indigenous cultures right now, the most high entities in the cosmos of all of those peoples, contemporary, indigenous, and ancient, including advanced civilizations like the Greeks and Romans, the highest entities of their cosmos were always thought of as divine beings. And therefore, philosophy's culminating level of inquiry or understanding was contemplation of and union with divinity. That is what philosophy culminates in. So this is why my book is tentatively titled Philosophy as Religion, because that is what philosophy in a very deep sense was. And because we have not understood that, we have systematically misunderstood the entire history of philosophy, because we have separated it from the history of Christianity, the history of Judaism, the history of Islam, and broadly speaking, the history of religion. The history of Western philosophy is a monumental aspect and chapter of the history of religion. And until and unless that is understood, it cannot be competently interpreted from a historical standpoint. If a person isn't interested in a historical interpretation, I have no criticism of their interpretations. If a person claims to be historically representing the past, and they do not understand the fundamental religious dimension of the entire philosophical and Western tradition, they will systematically distort the thinkers they are interpreting at the most significant levels. And it is not a result of any incompetence, it's not a result of any vice, and it's not the result of any conspiracy. It's simply the fact that by not understanding a certain profound set of relevant contextual factors, you cannot see certain highly relevant things in the appropriate light. And maybe you'll see them in a different creative misunderstanding. That's fine. Again, there's a lot of value to that. It's just not history. It's something else. So when we put Heidegger in his historical context, and we recognize that his work is self-consciously a treatment of metaphysics, and we know that Heidegger is perfectly aware, as someone raised in the scholastic Catholic tradition, that metaphysics is a science that deals with divinity, we know that Heidegger knows that metaphysics is in a very complicated, you could say, duplex or duplicitous relationship with theology. So, what metaphysics originally was, just to be clear, was theology. And if you didn't know where theology comes from, the first occurrence in the word in an extant text in Greek is in Plato's Republic, Book 2. So Plato invented even the word theologia. And so if you don't understand theology in the context of ancient Greek philosophy, you will systematically screw up your interpretation of the rise of Christianity, Judaism, all of that stuff. It's inevitable. And it doesn't mean it's because the person isn't smart. Plenty of these people know far more than I do. However, if you work from the wrong interpretive assumptions, you'll have systematic biases built into your work, which we all do, but ideally we correct them once we become aware of them. So having now explained that metaphysics was originally theology, we need to say a bit more about, but what about metaphysics when it thinks it's a separate tradition? And I'm not going to go too much into this until I do a commentary, particularly in the second page of the introduction of Sein and Zeit, but let me say something briefly about this, because there's a ton of nonsense by incredibly gifted, smart people whom I admire about this subject, because they take Heidegger's word for it when they interpret the history of philosophy. So, metaphysics, insofar as it claims, or has any claim to be a special science in the Western tradition, is a science of being, and this is very ambiguous. So I now want to introduce a grammatical distinction related to what I mentioned in the first lecture, and I'm going to talk a bit about its importance and then expend the next lecture talking about it in detail. Metaphysics as a science of being could be metaphysics as a science of the study of things under the aspect of their active sense of existing, which you could say is the participial sense of their being, if you will, or of their existing. Metaphysics could also be a study of being under the aspect of the nature of ultimate reality, or the sense or the meaning of what to be means. So whether you're studying the participle, being, or it's something like the infinitive, like enai, or whether a word like ousia, which gets translated to immense confusion in the history of philosophy, ousia becomes translated often as substance, which creates enormous problems in the English translations of works like Aristotle's Metaphysics, not because there's anything wrong with the way Cicero and others translated it in Latin, but it's very, very confusing. But words like ousia, words like phrases like haon, if you know the Tetragrammaton, Exodus 3:14, I believe, the most central sort of philosophical passage in the entire Hebrew Bible is in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. A central phrase that's crucial to understanding the history of philosophy is that in the Jewish Bible, in Greek, God reveals God's divine self as saying, ego eimi haon. I am the being. I am the, meaning the existing one. It is a nominalized present active participle. So, and that is part of the heresy of Jesus when Jesus says ego eimi in one of his famous discourses, as the Pharisees and the educated religious people hear him as uttering heresy by invoking the divine name in reference to his own identity. So this is a crucially important phrase in Greek, in the history of the Greek development of Jewish and Christian philosophy and Platonism. So this is all part of the background of metaphysics. So if one thinks one can understand the history of metaphysics without being at the same time studying the history of theology, there is no way one can do that, because the only space that metaphysics can clear for itself is by presumptively ignoring all of these unquestionably real historical connections to theology, like the fact that theology was its first name, that theology was a very accurate description of what Aristotle called first philosophy, because it dealt with divine entities. So as you can see now, the very question of God and whether God can be posed or is posable or is posed in the text of Sein and Zeit implicates the extent to which Sein and Zeit as a metaphysical text is capable of self-consciously engaging its own position in the tradition of Western philosophy as a form of theology. And Heidegger knows that Western philosophy is deeply entangled with theology. Heidegger himself is deeply influenced by people like Luther and Schleiermacher and Meister Eckhart and countless other theological figures. And there is no way to cordon off these religious influences. It's crazy to try to do that, because philosophy and religion ultimately cannot be separated in that way. But Heidegger must present himself, according to his own self-understanding, as a philosopher in a, if not secular mode, a mode that is free of any commitment to any religious tradition. And I get that, but the simple fact is that is one of the deepest reasons that Heidegger does not help a person understand his own texts. You must understand what Heidegger understood but denied that he understood, or pretended that he didn't understood, or never acknowledged that he understood, in order to understand what he was actually doing, which is that the text of Sein and Zeit must be simultaneously read as a work of metaphysics in its moment in Germany, as a work of metaphysics and philosophy in its moment and self-positioning in the history of Western philosophy, and yet also, most fundamentally and yet most ambiguously and with most difficulty, it must be read as a work which is at the same time, because of its prior identities, not in spite of, but because of its prior identities, it is an innovative work, one of the most innovative works in the 20th century of Western theology. And therefore, I will be interpreting the text as a work of metaphysics and theology, and I see no salient, stable way of separating those two terms when you're interpreting a text like Heidegger's. So that, I hope, gives you some sense of kind of what for me is the very exciting nature of bringing philosophy and religion together and showing how they can help illuminate the past and even the present and the future, and specifically in relationship to Heidegger. So we'll get into some more of this material and help prepare the way for an understanding of Heidegger's contribution to metaphysics in the next few lectures. Thank you very much for joining me. Please do like the video, and please do subscribe to my channel and check out my other material if you're interested. Thanks.